March is really becoming Israeli Apartheid Month. This started in Canada, which I think also goes to show the global nature of the struggle now against Israeli apartheid. The UK may be like the United States in another respect, which is that nobody here knows very much about Canada. Is that accurate? Or except the Queen, you share the same Queen. But what was so interesting about my time in Canada was how Israeli Apartheid Month has become a national issue. Have any of the party leaders here said anything about Israeli Apartheid Month, or any politicians, or Israeli Apartheid Week? Well, in Canada now, and this I think is a very good sign, all the leaders of the major parties compete to issue statements condemning Israeli Apartheid Week. So there was a statement while I was in Canada by the leader of the Liberal Party, who is the leader of the opposition in Canada and would-be Prime Minister. He issued a statement saying the following. Israeli Apartheid Week is an attack on the mutual respect that holds our society together. It is a dangerous cocktail of ignorance and intolerance, both of which stand in the way of peace. The Liberal Party of Canada condemns Israeli Apartheid Week in no uncertain terms. And he goes on, and then he says, Israeli Apartheid Week he says about how we have to have dialogue and peace and all sorts of things that everybody would support. And then he says, Israeli Apartheid Week does the opposite by portraying the Jewish state as criminal, by demonizing Israel and its supporters, and by targeting Jewish and Israeli students for abuse on our university campuses. The organizers and supporters of Israeli Apartheid Week tarnish our freedom of speech. And he goes on to say, the voices of anti-Semitism and intolerance have no place in Canada, in the Middle East, or anywhere in the world. All Canadians and all university students have the right to feel safe and secure in our communities, regardless of who they are or what they believe. Now, what's interesting about that statement, and I won't be surprised if by next year British politicians are making similar statements, is how it doesn't address in any way the issues that students are raising with Israeli Apartheid Week, now being marked on 80%, on 80 campuses, or rather 80 cities, and many more campuses around the world. What it does is it targets people who want to talk about the issues. It claims, rather falsely, that they're anti-Semitic, that they're calling for Jewish students to be intimidated. There's actually no evidence of that whatsoever, no example of that given, of anyone calling for Jewish or Israeli students to be intimidated or harassed on campuses. And it attempts really to shut down discussion. I think it's important, you know, Canada, this is an example. I suppose this would be the equivalent of David Miliband making such a statement in this country, or David Cameron. But we can already see similar tactics creeping into the discourse in the UK. And I think the significance of this is that it, to me, is an indication that we are reaching a sort of tipping point, where the discussion of Israeli apartheid and ending it is becoming mainstream to the extent that the tactics that have to be used are more and more sort of repressive and rather belligerent. I don't know if okay, I want to get this up. I think I have to switch this. No. I'm just going to keep pressing buttons until something happens. There we go. All right, 2 copies of the same story. But this is really a frightening development right here. This was published in Haaretz, which is sort of the main reputedly center-left newspaper of record in Israel. And this is just actually from a few days ago, well, from yesterday, from March 21st. Military intelligence monitoring left-wing organizations. And what this says, if you read carefully, is that Israeli military intelligence is collecting information about left-wing organizations abroad that the army sees as aiming to delegitimize Israel. And if you read on, you'll see that left-wing is defined as any organization that doesn't completely accept Israel's rationales and reasoning and so on and so forth. You can see that they specifically mention the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign and Palestine solidarity work all over the world. So we're in the extraordinary situation now where potentially the Israeli military is spying. We don't know, I don't have any information that this is the case, but potentially that the Israeli military will spy on Leeds PSC or on Palestine solidarity groups of other kinds around the country in the UK. The reason I think it's reasonable to believe that is a report published just last year by the Reut Institute. Who's heard of the Reut Institute? Quite a few people. I'm just going to pull it up and you can look at it later. This was published in February 2010, roughly, so just over a year ago. And it was a report by an Israeli think tank, very close to the Israeli government, run by a former Israeli government advisor, that called, and these are its words, called for the Israeli government and intelligence services to sabotage and attack the global Palestine solidarity movement, including gathering intelligence on them and using it to discredit and to sort of malign and to cripple people working for justice in Palestine. So it's very important to sort of tie the dots together and also to understand that these sorts of campaigns are being coordinated with pro-Israel groups around the world, in the United States and the United Kingdom and Europe. And David will talk more about those kinds of groups, so I won't say more about it. But the point I want to make is that whereas all these, it would be nice if I could get different things on both screens, but I don't know how to do that. The important point here is that we are facing, at this time, a systematic attempt to shut down discussion of this issue, and particularly to target groups that are talking about Israeli apartheid. Why is it important to talk about Israeli apartheid? For one, we can ask, it's the subject of a long lecture that I have time to do now, but is Israel an apartheid state? We can look at the big picture. For 63 years of its existence, you've had millions of Palestinians who have been living in their own country without any civil or political rights whatsoever. When we were up in Scotland a few days ago, I visited the beautiful country estate of Lord Balfour, the former estate, and I declared it to be the property of the Palestinian people, just the way he had declared Palestine to be the property of the Zionist movement. But that beautiful country made me think. It really made me imagine, as I walked through the private church, the grounds of the private church of the Balfour family, and saw the gravestones of generation after generation of Balfours and their relatives going back many hundreds of years, and this peaceful tranquility. And I thought how unjust it was that for the people of Palestine, that continuity, that ability to remain in their country, to continue to live as they had been so violently and brutally interrupted by Zionist colonization. And that dispossession has continued now for 63 years. And moreover, what we see is Israel's the various forms of discrimination which affect Palestinians escalating in so many ways. From brutal violence, today Israel shelled the Gaza Strip, killing a family of 5, including a child of 11 years old. According to the Israeli army, they fired, and I was trying to get that up on Haaretz as well, they claim that mortars were fired from Gaza, and they fired back from where they said the mortars came from several hours after the mortars were fired. It makes you wonder whether this wasn't a deliberate attempt to inflict violence and death on Palestinians in Gaza, 80% of whom are refugees from lands and villages that are now inside Israel. So that form of really a crude brutality at its worst, of corralling people into effectively a prison, a large open-air prison at one extreme, to the sorts of racist laws that exist against Palestinian citizens of Israel, the 1.4 million Palestinians who hold Israeli citizenship, and the raft of laws now that have either made their way through the Knesset or are doing so now, such as I won't talk about land because I think David may be talking about the land situation, but just some of the more recent laws, for example, the Admissions Committee Bill, which really can be likened to the Group Areas Act that existed in apartheid South Africa, which gives Jewish communities the right to restrict who lives in them in order to prevent Arabs, Palestinians from moving into those communities. The law that just passed its second reading that makes it illegal to advocate for boycott of Israel. I'm going to say more about boycott of Israel in a few moments, and makes that punishable with fines and imprisonment, to laws that make it illegal to commemorate the Nakba, the expulsion of the Palestinians in 1948. These are all examples of laws that are going through the Knesset now. A few months ago, roughly 300 Israeli municipal rabbis, these are state rabbis whose salaries are paid by the government, so with taxpayer money, issued a decree calling for a boycott of any Israeli Jew who rents or sells a home to a Palestinian or to an Arab. This is another example of the kind of societal racism and discrimination that has really become mainstream within Israel. It's in the face of all these kinds of denials of rights that we see, in a sense, a total impasse in terms of any international efforts to bring an end to this. For more than 20 years, we've had a so-called peace process that has gone absolutely nowhere. On the contrary, it's under the guise and cover of this peace process that Israel has deepened its colonization of Palestinian lands, continued its quiet, bureaucratic, ethnic cleansing of Jerusalem. This is something that I think people often don't understand. I'll give you an example. Often when I travel, I meet Palestinian students from Jerusalem who may be studying at Leeds or at some of the universities in Canada I visited recently. Born in Jerusalem, their parents born in Jerusalem, but because they're studying abroad, they fear every time they go back home, every time they visit their family, that at the airport the Israelis will confiscate their Jerusalem ID on the pretext that they have left and that they are no longer eligible to maintain Jerusalem residency. Now, this is very odd. In many countries, you have something called permanent residency. In the United States, for example, or in Canada, I don't know what the laws are in the UK. But it's basically, you have the right to live and work in the country. You're not a citizen, you have the right to live there. You have most of the rights of a citizen, except perhaps, you don't vote. In the United States, if you're a permanent resident, if you have what's called a green card, and you leave the United States for more than a year without notifying them, when you come back, it's possible that they'll say to you, you abandoned your residency. Your green card is conditional on you maintaining your residency in the United States. That's what it means. And, you have to reapply or whatever. Israel treats Palestinians in Jerusalem as if they were permanent residents who'd emigrated to Jerusalem from a foreign country. It treats them exactly the same way. And Jerusalemites who leave for a year might find that they are not allowed back. Isn't that odd, given that they were born in the country, that their parents were born there, that they lived there before there was a state of Israel, before Israel occupied Jerusalem? But if you're a British Jew, or a Canadian, or an American, or whatever else, and you respond to one of these advertisements from the Jewish agency inviting you to emigrate to Israel, you will be treated as a native. You'll be given citizenship. You might be given money to help you buy a home, perhaps on land taken from Palestinians who have been forced to go somewhere else. And you're treated, the immigrant is treated as a native, and the native is treated as an immigrant. And this is the essence of Israeli apartheid, and it's the essence of Zionism. The fundamental denial of the rights of indigenous people in the country. So in the face of this, we see absolutely no response, not from the European Union. In fact, David will talk more about that, so I won't say much more than to say that the European Union, under the guise of supporting the peace process, is actually subsidizing and promoting these sorts of Israeli policies, subsidizing them by paying billions of euros a year to maintain Palestinians on a sort of humanitarian life support, while never putting any pressure on Israel to change the situation. The United States is, of course, as we know, completely complicit in this situation. They won't even vote for a UN resolution condemning settlements written in language taken directly from State Department communiques. Recently, the Palestinian Authority tried to get such a resolution, quoting text taken from the American policy, and the Americans vetoed their own policy in the UN Security Council. Extraordinary. So in the face of this, we've seen, for example, a number of legal decisions. In 2004, the International Court of Justice in The Hague declared the wall that Israel is building through the West Bank to annex large tracts of Palestinian land. The ICJ declared it illegal and said that countries had a responsibility to not only do nothing to assist Israel to continue building this wall, but to actually make sure it's torn down. And what happened? Nothing. We didn't see any of the governments rushing to enforce either UN resolutions or ICJ decisions. So it was in the wake of that, in light of all of this, that Palestinian civil society issued in 2005 its unified call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And some of you here will be familiar with what the demands of the BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Campaign, are. But I want to just reiterate it here for those who are new to this. In 2005, several hundred Palestinian civil society organizations from across Palestine and the diaspora called on international civil society, that means you and us, the PSC, churches and other communities around the world, trade unions, and so on, to implement broad-based boycotts, divestment, and sanctions campaigns against Israel, against institutions, and against the state that are complicit in Israeli human rights abuses until Israel satisfies three basic human rights conditions demanded in international law. First, ending the occupation and colonization of all Arab lands occupied since 1967. That means in Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Second, recognizing the fundamental rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality. And third, respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN resolutions. So those are the three conditions Palestinian civil society collectively is asking for help in pressuring Israel to do. What's noticeable about these conditions is that none of them, contrary to some of the propaganda that has been issued about Israeli Apartheid Week and so on, none of them are anti-Semitic. They don't say any word about denying Israeli Jews a single legitimate right to which they're entitled. What they talk about is respecting and guaranteeing equal rights for Palestinians. The question has been raised in a number of settings about the legitimacy of something like academic boycott. Should we engage in academic boycott? Shouldn't academic exchange be sacred? Shouldn't it be above politics? Isn't the exchange of human knowledge and ideas to be considered actually a means to promote the sort of peace and dialogue we're talking about? And this has been used, particularly in universities, to try to shut down academic boycott efforts. The first thing to point out, and you can get more information about academic boycott from the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, PACB, is that it doesn't target individuals. It's not a call for a boycott of Israeli professors or students or people just because they're Israeli. Certainly not because they're Jewish. This is one of the lies that has been constantly told. It is a call for a boycott of institutions, of Israeli institutions, of joint research projects, of joint programs, conferences that involve official Israeli or Israeli university auspices, because Israeli universities have been so complicit in many of the human rights abuses that I've been talking about. For example, Tel Aviv University is very deeply involved in military recruitment, in weapons research. The university itself is built on the ruins of several ethnically cleansed Palestinian villages, something that's not acknowledged at all, by the way, on the university campus. The same can be said about about other Israeli universities. Incidentally, the news came just the other day that Bob Geldof, many of you in this room, I'm showing my age, are too young to remember when Bob Geldof was actually a musician. But Bob Geldof, who used to be a musician, it was reported has agreed to go to Ben Gurion University, which is in the Negev and which is built on lands of Palestinian Bedouin who have been consistently forced from them to accept an honorary degree. And that's exactly the kind of thing Palestinians are calling on international celebrities and figures not to do. Bob Geldof should not do that. He should follow the example of others who've refused that kind of complicity and normalization of Israeli apartheid. But if you look at the Israeli tactics in academic boycott, whereas Palestinians are calling for a boycott of institutions, Israel impedes Palestinian academic freedom in so many countless ways, including through bombing of universities. And this is something that really never comes up in the debate. Anytime somebody tells you, I oppose academic boycott, ask them, do you oppose Israel's boycott and bombing of Palestinian universities? For example, the Islamic University in Gaza was bombed to rubble, large parts of it, in December 2008, January 2009. That's a university where 60% of the students are women. Of the 640 government and UN-run primary and secondary schools in the Gaza Strip, 18 were completely destroyed by Israeli bombing during Operation Cast Lead at the end of 2008, and more than 240 were damaged. So half the schools in the Gaza Strip were hit by Israeli bombing. Now remember, the Israelis always tell us how moral and careful and accurate their military is. That's when they're being careful that they managed to hit half the schools in the Gaza Strip. And of course, since then, their boycott has continued in the form of not allowing any construction supplies into Gaza for the reconstruction of these schools. They have banned paper and glue for and ink for textbooks. The electricity crisis, still 8 to 10 hours a day of blackouts in Gaza. They just kidnapped the chief engineer of the only power plant in Gaza. He was in Ukraine a few weeks ago, and he was kidnapped by the Israeli Mossad. He was visiting family in the Ukraine. His wife is Ukrainian. He was kidnapped, and he's now in Ashkelon prison in Israel. So the darkness that Israel imposes on Gaza's 750,000 children and young people is also a form of academic boycott. Some of you may have seen the pictures of children studying or trying to study by the light of candles and gas lamps. All of these are systematic forms of denying people education, denying them knowledge. Of course, the siege prevents Palestinian academics from traveling, from engaging in the kind of exchange that Israeli and British academics take for granted. So, with every aspect of the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, you have to weigh any potential harm that is done. There may be some Israeli academics who are very much with us in terms of seeking justice, who can't do something they would want to do because of the academic boycott. But you have to weigh that harm against the greater harm that we're trying to remedy. Back in the 1980s, when South African apartheid was the issue that was firing up young people on campuses around the world. There was also a debate about sanctions, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Looking back, those of us who remember that time, we would like to think everybody was in favor of sanctions against apartheid South Africa. How could you not be, right? Well, the General Synod of the Church of England voted against divestment from apartheid South Africa in 1988. Nobody remembers that now. Everyone remembers themselves as a hero in the struggle against apartheid. Many people were uncomfortable with academic boycott then. And Mrs. Thatcher, anyone here know who Mrs. Thatcher is? She seems to be back. She used to say again, in advocating against sanctions on South Africa, sanctions hurt the people they're supposed to help. The idea here was, if we boycott South African companies and businesses, then the black workers who will be out of work because of the sanctions are the ones who will be hurt. The response of South African civil society, of people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu at that time, was, please don't polish the chains of our captivity. When you say you just want to ameliorate our conditions under apartheid, you're merely polishing our chains. And Palestinians are now saying very much the same thing. My 25 minutes are pretty much up, but I want to end by saying something about the goals of Palestinians today. I mentioned the three conditions that the BDS movement has put forward: ending occupation and colonization of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, recognizing the rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality, and respecting the rights of Palestinian refugees, including the right of return. What's important is that these three conditions, these 3 points, it doesn't prescribe whether it should be in the context of a one-state solution, a two-state solution, or a 10-state solution. And that's important because many people wonder about that. That's quite a hot debate now. I happen to support a single state in Palestine. I think that a single state already exists from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, but it's an apartheid state. And the struggle now is no longer over division of land, but guaranteeing full equality for all the people who live in that country, which, by the way, includes Israeli Jews, whose status would be transformed from that of settlers, colonizers, and occupiers to ordinary citizens. Would it involve some losses for Israeli Jews? Yes, it would involve the loss of undue privilege. But what they would gain in terms of recognition and citizenship is, I think, something that can never be gained through repression, violence, bombing, and building of walls, and through the tactics that we see increasingly used now of demonizing and dehumanizing Palestinians and all those who stand with their rights. Let me end by saying that I think we've come, many of us for whom Palestine has been part of our lives or who care about it, have come to think of this struggle because it's gone on for so long. My parents are of the first generation of Palestinians who lived through the Nakba, who were forced from their homes as children. And since then, many generations of Palestinians have been born in exile, in refugee camps, under occupation, or as second-class citizens in a so-called Jewish and democratic state. We've gotten used to thinking of a solution of justice as being something that is very distant, that we may or may not see in our lifetimes. And I think we're at a moment where we really have to change the way we think about it. We have to see this struggle as one that we can win in the next few years. And that must be our goal. And there is, I think, I hate to use Harold Macmillan's term, the winds of change are blowing really through the region. We see that in the revolutions and uprisings that are going on. But also, I think, in the desperation of the Israeli resistance to the end of apartheid, the lack of a positive message, the lack of a vision, the inability of Israeli apartheid to embrace universal values. So we have to push for this. And Palestinians, I think, are counting on students around the world. Yesterday I was in Glasgow and walking through Nelson Mandela Place. And that was a time back in the 80s when cities across the UK and the world were naming streets and squares for the struggle in South Africa. That was the history that your parents made, and ending apartheid in Palestine, I think, is the history you will make. Thank you.